By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War was tightening around Japan. Front lines were collapsing, fuel was scarce, and every transport that slipped through the blockade carried supplies the Empire could no longer replace. Convoys moved mostly at night now. Tight formations, minimal radio use, hoping darkness would protect what armor couldn't. Late in July, one of those convoys, a column of 23 ships, from escorts to fully loaded tankers, pushed east across a stretch of the Philippine Sea where the sky was black enough to erase the horizon. Far to the north, USS Parch ran on the surface, cutting through warm Pacific wind. Commander Lawson, Red Ramage, stood on the bridge, eyes fixed on a darkness so complete the bow seemed to disappear into it. Somewhere ahead, engines pulsed through the night air. Then a Japanese flare burst open. A white bloom climbed into the sky, followed by another. Light washed across the water and revealed the convoy, ships shifting course in rapid, nervous movements. Ramage finally saw his target, and Pasha was already closing the gap while the convoy remained unaware. Ramage wanted submarines long before he fully understood the life inside one. The appeal wasn't secrecy or danger. It was the precision, the machinery, the way every component had to work in perfect sequence. He studied constantly, preparing for a path he thought he could shape through effort alone. The part he couldn't control was his eyesight. The Navy flagged the issue. Ramage found a way around it. He memorized the eye chart, passed the exam, and moved on without fanfare. Those who knew him later said the story fit him perfectly. When confronted with a barrier, he looked for the seam and pushed through. Before earning command, he rotated through roles that exposed him to every corner of a submarine: radio, navigation, engineering. He learned the systems in tight spaces, surrounded by heat, noise, and equipment that demanded attention. That experience shaped his style. He noticed problems quickly, expected clear answers, and carried himself without theatrics or speeches. People remembered his confidence because it was quiet but certain. He didn't force authority. He operated as if responsibility naturally rested with him. Promotions followed not because he reached for them, but because he already behaved like a man prepared to take charge. On the morning everything changed. Ramage was at Pearl Harbor, expecting another routine day. The harbor was calm, the sort of quiet that settles before the work begins. Minutes later, aircraft dropped out of the sky in sharp angles, engines screaming across the water as explosions rolled through the fleet. He watched battleships burn from the shoreline, crews firing from decks already collapsing, boats racing through smoke searching for survivors. The sense of standing still while others fought stayed with him. He wasn't afraid, just trapped in place while the harbor burned. When the attack ended, the silence was heavier than the noise that preceded it. Ramage didn't speak much about what he felt that day, but those around him noticed a shift. The margin for hesitation seemed to disappear from his voice. He asked for submarines again. This time, no one questioned the urgency. His assignment to USS Grenadier put him exactly where he wanted to be, out where the Navy could strike back. On the first patrol, he worked the periscope and firing solutions with a precision that surprised even senior officers. The attack that earned him the Silver Star was fast, clean, and decisive. Ramage took command of USS Trout at a time when the submarine force carried most of the Pacific War on its shoulders. Targets were everywhere, and Trout found them often. Hitting them was the problem. On one patrol, Trout closed on the battleship Kirishima with a perfect firing solution. 5 torpedoes ran cleanly from the tubes, none performing as designed. Some steered off course, others struck without detonating. Kirishima sailed on untouched while tension settled through the control room. The next patrol brought the same frustration. Trout targeted a freighter, fired 2 torpedoes, and watched one fizzle with a weak blast while the other never exploded. Ramage ordered the boat to surface. The gun crews opened up with 50 cals and the deck gun, tearing through the freighter until it slowed enough for 2 point-blank torpedoes to finish the job. It wasn't textbook submarine warfare, but it was the only option when the primary weapon failed. His reports made the issue clear. The Mark 14 torpedo couldn't be trusted. Senior command insisted otherwise, placing the blame on crews rather than the weapon. By the end of Trout's 4th patrol, the verdict came back that he was too conservative, even after firing nearly every torpedo aboard and pressing a surface attack that pushed the limits of what a submarine could attempt. The reassignment brought Ramage to the main shipyards, where a new Balao-class submarine was nearing completion. Compared to the older boats he had served on, this one felt balanced from the start. Stronger hull, smoother engines, tighter responses. Even during early trials, Parch handled cleanly, as if the boat anticipated what was asked of her. Ramage followed every test personally. He moved through the compartments with a familiarity that made the crew assume he'd been aboard longer than he had. By the time Parch left Maine for the Pacific, she already felt like a platform built for the kind of command style he carried. When they reached Pearl Harbor, the tone across the base had shifted. After years of resistance, the Navy finally acknowledged what frontline crews had been reporting. The Mark 14 torpedo had been defective. Depth settings were wrong, magnetic exploders unreliable, contact pistols inconsistent. The weapon was redesigned, and the new batches worked. Parch's first patrol placed her in a wolf pack with Bang and Steelhead. Shared operations weren't every commander's preference, but the results were strong. Together, the group disrupted Japanese traffic, and Parch claimed 2 sinkings clean hits. No dud torpedoes, no confusion over outcomes. Before the second patrol, new orders arrived. Wolfpack Commander Lou Parks would ride aboard Parch. It was standard procedure, but everyone felt the friction immediately. Parks commanded the mission, Ramage commanded the boat. That overlap settled like weight in the control room. Even so, preparations continued: torpedo loads, charts, codes, fuel checks. Parch's second patrol pushed her deep into areas where Japanese shipping still moved under heavy escort. Late on July 30th, a message broke across the Wolfpack circuit. Steelhead had contact, a large formation, escorts, transports, tankers, and a flagship. Parch turned immediately. Finding such a convoy required luck. Closing with it required precision. Darkness hid everything, and without moonlight, even the horizon vanished. Sonar sweeps from Japanese destroyers forced Parch to run carefully, adjusting speed and bearing with each report. Inside the control room, tension built over radio silence. Parks insisted Steelhead would update them. Ramage believed they were running blind. Hours passed with no confirmation. Finally, Ramage ordered a transmission. Steelhead replied at once. The convoy had changed course, and Parch was heading the wrong direction. The correction snapped the boat onto a new track, engines driving hard through the black water. Ahead of them, the convoy moved in layered protection. Escorts on the outside, transports and tankers clustered in the center. The commander aboard, Agura Maru. Parch pushed toward the estimated intercept point. Then the horizon brightened. Flares rose in arcs, bursting high above the formation. Steelhead's attack had begun. Light spilled across the water, revealing ships twisting into evasive turns, escorts peeling away in search patterns. Steelhead was already in action when Parch reached visual range. Flashes inside the convoy marked clean torpedo hits, one ship sagging forward, another listing, a third burning along its midsection. After firing all 10 torpedoes, Steelhead submerged, leaving the formation in turmoil. The Japanese response was immediate. Flares climbed in rapid bursts, turning the night into a stark white glare. Under the sudden light, the entire convoy took shape. Tankers in the center, cargo ships staggered behind them, destroyers cutting outward in fast, sweeping arcs. Parch stayed just outside the brightest radius, using the shifting veil of darkness and flare light to her advantage. The illumination made the escorts alert, but it also revealed everything Ramage needed. Distances, lanes, how the formation tightened and twisted after Steelhead's strike. Destroyers focused on the wrong sector, convinced the lone attacker was somewhere in the wreckage Steelhead had just created. Their outward sweeps opened small but critical gaps near the convoy's interior columns. Parch eased forward. Each flare washed the water in white again, threatening exposure, but the contrast worked in Parch's favor. Smoke from the damaged ships distorted lines of sight. The escorts were responding to threats they could see. None expected a second submarine to approach on the surface. Ramage tracked a tanker through his binoculars. Behind it, more ships overlapped in the drifting illumination, their movements uneven as officers tried to reform the disrupted lanes. Those shifting gaps were the openings Parch needed. Below deck, the crew stayed quiet, waiting for bearings to settle. Above them, Ramage continued scanning the illuminated water, destroyers hunting in the wrong direction, the convoy tightening in confusion, and a surface approach path forming exactly where chaos had pulled the ships out of line. Parch moved closer, until the destroyers drifting outward were no longer the immediate threat. Their hunt carried them too far from the convoy's center, leaving a narrow corridor between 2 columns of merchant ships. Ramage seized it. He ordered a sweeping 270-degree turn, a maneuver tight enough to pull Parch past the outer screen and directly into the formation. Suddenly, the submarine was surrounded by towering hulls, their wakes crossing only yards away. From the bridge, the scale felt overwhelming. The problem appeared instantly. Everything was too close. Torpedoes couldn't arm at such short range. Ramage studied the shifting gaps, following the uneven motion left by Steelhead's earlier strikes. A freighter had drifted just far enough out of column to offer a viable shot. Parch fired one torpedo. The hit landed cleanly, pushing the freighter out of formation and opening a wider lane deeper into the convoy. A tanker sat in that space, large, slow to adjust, and fully exposed. 4 forward torpedoes ran true. The tanker erupted and folded into the sea, flames rising in a column that lit half the formation. The convoy staggered again. Escorts signaled frantically. Transports veered to avoid collision. In the reshuffling, Parch swung toward a high-riding vessel illuminated by drifting flare light. The flagship Agura Maru. 3 stern torpedoes were ready. 2 struck near the engine spaces, lifting the stern before dropping it into a heavy list. The flagship slowed almost to a stop, steam venting through ruptured lines. The convoy's order collapsed. Columns bent, signals crossed, escorts hesitated. The explosions around the flagship pushed the escorts into a frantic sweep, but none of them were looking where Parche actually was. The submarine had slipped behind a line of transports and now rode the darkness between 2 columns. Engines steady, decks slick with spray. The last stern torpedo had left the tubes. Every forward tube was empty. The next move would have to come from inside the boat. He ordered the reload. Below deck, men went straight to work. A Mark 14 torpedo stretched 20 feet from nose to tail, weighed more than a truck engine, and needed careful handling even in calm seas. Parch wasn't calm. The boat rolled with every nearby detonation, shaking tools and straining hoists, as the crew wrestled the torpedoes into alignment. Reloading underwater was slow. Reloading on the surface under fire bordered on impossible. But Parch didn't dive. Ramage stayed on the open bridge, rain and spray blowing across his face, tracking the shapes of ships shifting through the flare light. Only a single quartermaster remained with him, silent, bracing against the railing, waiting in case orders came too quickly for the men below to hear. The escorts closed in again. Searchlights swept across the water. A few ran wide enough to catch the shine on Parcher's railing, but distance and smoke disguised the silhouette. The reload crew kept hoisting, sliding, locking each torpedo into place with a speed no one had ever attempted under fire. 4 minutes passed. 2 forward tubes were ready. Ramage took the shot the moment he had the range. Parch fired both torpedoes at a freighter that had drifted out of alignment during the confusion. The ship staggered almost immediately, its hull splitting along the port side before it sank in a slow roll. Flames from the earlier tanker explosion reflected off the water, giving the sinking ship a dull orange outline as it disappeared. More destroyers converged. Their gunfire rattled the air above the bridge, tracers cutting short lines through the smoke. Ramage didn't leave his position. He waited until searchlights began hunting for the gap between the lanes, waited until the escorts focused on the wrong angles, then ordered the boat ahead, sliding Parch behind the wounded flagship like a shadow. Agura Maru's aft guns couldn't depress far enough to hit the submarine. Her escorts hesitated, unwilling to fire directly through their own commander's ship. 3 stern torpedoes were ready. Parch edged out from behind the flagship just far enough to clear her wake. The bearing lined up cleanly. Ramage gave the order. 3 torpedoes ran true. The flagship's lights flickered as the blasts tore through the lower decks. She sagged at the center, then settled unevenly as columns of steam and smoke poured upward. The escort screen faltered again, caught between orders and instinct, unable to decide which target still mattered. Inside the control room, men steadied themselves against the bulkheads, listening to the blasts echo through the hull. Each detonation meant the reload gamble was paying off. Each hit meant the convoy was unraveling faster than any crew in the Pacific had ever witnessed. Parch pushed through the drifting smoke, still on the surface, still close enough to the convoy that the sound of engines echoed between the hulls. The flagship was dying slowly, listing under its own weight, and the escorts were finally turning inward to cover it. Their formations overlapped, signals clashed, orders cut across one another in sharp bursts of light. A gunboat broke from the confusion and charged straight toward Parche. Its bow rose and fell through the waves, engines straining, searchlight hunting across the water. The distance collapsed quickly. The quartermaster on the bridge shouted down through the hatch, and the men at the controls reacted before Ramage even spoke. Parch surged ahead. The submarine angled just enough to slide past the gunboat's path. As the two vessels crossed within reach of each other's railings, Ramage watched the Japanese bridge flash by only yards away. Spray swept across both decks. Officers on the gunboat stared back in disbelief. Ramage tipped his cap as the gunboat roared past. The maneuver brought only a few seconds of clean water, but another problem appeared almost immediately. A large transport cutting across Parch's bow. It was packed with troops, thousands of soldiers filling the decks below. The ship was moving slowly, engines struggling to keep pace with the rest of the convoy. Ramage ordered the shot. 2 torpedoes ran out from the forward tubes. The transport shuddered, stopped, and held its position as if frozen in place. The escorts tried to reorient, but the flagship's collapse was blocking half the formation. Ramage took Parch deeper into the gap, gauging the angle, then fired again. The final torpedo struck under the forward hold. The blast lifted the transport's bow and rolled it sharply to one side. Water poured in through the fractured plating, pulling the ship down by the head. Lights flickered across the tilt of its decks as it slipped under, stern rising for a moment before disappearing. Parch continued forward without slowing. Searchlights scanned the wrong sectors. Escorts circled fading wakes. The submarine traced a narrow line through the debris and smoke, using the darkness outside the flare radius the same way it had used it to enter. Within minutes, the convoy's noise faded behind them. When Parch reached Pearl Harbor, the docks were already crowded. Word had moved faster than the submarine itself. Steelhead's report, scattered Japanese signals, and fragmentary intelligence all pointed to a night unlike anything the Pacific Fleet had seen. Officers gathered along the pier as Parch eased in, paint scorched, deck stained from hours under gunfire. Admiral Lockwood stepped forward before the lines were even secured. He looked up at the bridge, searching for the figure who had stayed exposed through the entire fight. Ramage climbed down the ladder, uniform stiff with salt, eyes still restless from a night spent watching silhouettes in flare light. Lockwood didn't wait for a formal report. He simply asked how many ships had gone down. The tally settled on 5 confirmed losses, though later committees would revise the official number. Everyone on Parch knew what they had seen. Tankers collapsing into themselves, transports breaking apart, the flagship sinking behind a curtain of steam. Tonnage estimates would be debated for years, but the crew never forgot the violence compressed into those 34 minutes. Ramage didn't talk much about the battle. He gave the credit to the men who had dragged 1,000-pound torpedoes into firing position under shell fire, to the helmsman who threaded the submarine between charging ships, to the lookout who never lost track of the approaching gunboat. He printed certificates for the crew with a single line at the bottom. The Medal of Honor came soon after. It was the first time in U.S. submarine history that a commanding officer received the nation's highest award and lived to stand at the ceremony. The citation described extraordinary heroism. His crew described something simpler. A man who refused to give up the surface when every instinct said to dive, who trusted his boat at point-blank range, who stayed on the bridge so they could fire without hesitation. Parch returned to service, but the night off Honshu became the benchmark against which every later patrol was measured. Officers studied Ramage's track and tried to understand how a single submarine had pierced a convoy that size, held the surface under that amount of fire, and come out whole. The answer wasn't in the torpedoes or the maneuvers. It was in the decisions. Quick, direct, unflinching. Decisions that turned confusion into opportunity, and a narrow opening into a collapse that reshaped how the Navy thought about surface attacks. Long after the damage reports were filed and the patrol log was sealed, the story of that night stayed with the men who lived it. Not because of the number of ships that went down, or the tonnage scattered across the seafloor, but because of what the moment revealed about them. In the space of 34 minutes, a crew pushed past every reasonable limit, fighting on the surface, reloading under fire, threading through a maze of steel they were never meant to enter. Ramage never called it courage. He treated it as a choice made when there was no time to debate, no room for hesitation, and no guarantee the next minute would still belong to them. The sea was lit by flare light, the convoy in turmoil, and a single submarine refused to back away from an opening that should never have existed. For anyone who studies the battle now, the scale of it can overshadow the simple truth at its center. The outcome wasn't shaped by the weapons or the ship. It was shaped by the people on board, men who kept moving forward when everything around them was breaking apart. The Pacific closed over the wrecks. The final flames burned out. The night went dark again. But the memory of those 34 minutes never faded.